B. Me. Sanchas, HR manager at tech company with 200 employees across engineering, Salis, and operations departments spread across 2 floors, had strong feminist beliefs about workplace harassment, passionate about creating an environment where women felt empowered to report misconduct, posted frequently on social media about believing women and importance of swift action when harassment claims were made, believed that women's reports of harassment should be believed immediately without skeptical investigation that could re-traumatize victims, got promoted to HR manager specifically because company wanted someone who'd take harassment seriously after industry scandals. One of my main priorities was implementing policy that treated harassment accusations as credible from moment they were reported, posted about how requiring extensive evidence before acting on harassment claims protected perpetrators and silenced victims. First harassment complaint under new policy came 2 months into role from female engineer about male colleague. Female engineer named Jessica reported that male developer named Christopher had made inappropriate comment about her appearance. Following new policy, immediately placed Christopher on administrative leave pending investigation, without hearing his side first. Assured Jessica her account was believed and she'd be protected throughout investigation process. Started investigation by documenting Jessica's account as factual description of what had occurred in workplace. Jessica described Christopher saying her dress looked nice during team meeting, which she'd experienced as sexual comment. Documented this as sexual harassment, creating hostile environment for female employee in professional setting. Interviewed Christopher, who seemed confused, saying he'd complimented her professional outfit, not made sexual comment. Explained he'd said that's a professional-looking dress when she'd mentioned buying it for client presentation. I said Jessica had experienced comment as sexual, which meant it was harassment regardless of his stated intent. Christopher said he'd complimented male colleagues on professional appearance too without it being considered harassment. I said impact on Jessica mattered more than his intent or whether he'd complimented men similarly. Concluded investigation, finding Christopher had created uncomfortable environment through appearance-based comment, issued formal written warning that would remain in his personnel file, permanently affecting future advancement. Christopher seemed frustrated, saying warning for compliment seemed excessive, but accepted discipline to move forward. Second complaint came month later from sales coordinator about account manager who'd allegedly excluded her from meeting. Female sales coordinator named Amanda reported male account manager named Vincent had deliberately excluded her from client meeting. She interpreted exclusion as gender-based harassment, attempting to undermine her role and contributions to account. Following policy placed Vincent on leave immediately and began investigation treating Amanda's interpretation as credible. Amanda described being left out of meeting with major client, where strategy for her accounts was discussed without her. Documented this as gender-based exclusion, creating hostile, discriminatory environment for female employee. Vincent explained he'd invited people currently working on active deliverables, and Amanda wasn't assigned to those specific projects. Showed project assignments demonstrating Amanda wasn't working on items being discussed in meetings she'd been excluded from. I said Amanda had experienced exclusion as discriminatory, which meant it had discriminatory impact regardless of project assignments. Vincent argued that including people not working on discussed projects would have been inefficient and confusing for client. I said perception of discrimination mattered more than operational efficiency. When female employee felt targeted, issued written warning for creating environment where female colleague felt excluded and undermined professionally. Third complaint came from administrative assistant about IT manager who'd allegedly spoken to her in condescending tone. Female administrative assistant named Riley reported male IT manager named Gregory had mansplained basic computer concepts to her. She'd experienced his technical explanation as condescending and sexist, assuming she didn't understand technology. Placed Gregory on leave and investigated treating Riley's experience of condescension as evidence of gender-based harassment. Riley described Gregory explaining how to clear browser cache when she'd asked for help with unrelated technical issue. Documented this as mansplaining, creating hostile environment by assuming female employee lacked technical knowledge. Gregory explained browser cache had been causing the issue she'd reported. So he'd explain solution while fixing it. That he explained technical concepts to everyone when relevant to solving their problems regardless of gender. I said Riley's experience of explanation as condescending mansplaining meant it had been inappropriate regardless of necessity. Gregory seemed exasperated, saying he couldn't do his IT job without explaining technical concepts to people. I said he needed to be more aware of how explanations came across to female colleagues who might experience them as condescending. Issued written warning about communication style, creating perception of gender-based condescension. After 3 months, had processed 12 harassment complaints, all resulting in warnings or discipline for accused male employees. Policy seemed to be working, with women feeling empowered to report and company taking swift action protecting them. Posted on social media about successful implementation of Believe Women policy creating safer workplace for female employees. Got hundreds of supportive comments praising bold stance on harassment and prioritizing women's experiences over skepticism. Started noticing concerning pattern where male employees seemed increasingly anxious and withdrawn in workplace interactions. Men were avoiding casual conversations with female colleagues. Seemed nervous about any interaction that could be misinterpreted. Several men had stopped giving feedback to women on their teams or having one-on-one meetings without witnesses present. One morning arrived at office to find several male employees had installed small cameras on their desks facing their workspace. Walked around floor counting at least 15 men who'd set up what looked like dashboard cameras or security cameras at desks. Called emergency meeting with male employees who'd installed cameras, asking what they were doing and why. Senior engineer named Marcus explained cameras were for their protection given current climate of harassment accusations. That multiple men had received warnings for normal workplace interactions that women had interpreted as harassment, and they felt they needed video evidence to defend themselves against potential accusations about things they hadn't done. I felt shocked and offended, asking if they were suggesting women were lying about harassment they'd experienced. Marcus said they weren't calling anyone liars, but interpretation of innocent interactions as harassment meant they needed protection. Another male employee said Christopher had been disciplined for complimenting professional outfit, which seemed like normal interaction. That Vincent had been written up for operational decision about meeting attendance that had nothing to do with gender, and Gregory had been punished for explaining technical solution to technical problem, which was literally his job. Started feeling defensive, saying those men had created environments where women felt harassed regardless of their intentions. Male developers said if compliments, meeting logistics, and technical explanations were all potential harassment, they needed evidence. That cameras would show what actually happened versus what someone might interpret or remember happening later. I said cameras violated privacy and created hostile surveillance environment for everyone in workspace. Marcus said hostile environment was being created by policy where any woman's interpretation of interaction became automatic discipline, that they'd all seen colleagues receive warnings for normal professional behavior and needed to protect themselves, told them cameras had to be removed immediately as they violated company policy about recording in workplace. Several men asked to see written policy prohibiting cameras since company had cameras in hallways and common areas. I said personal desk cameras were different from company security cameras and created uncomfortable environment. They said uncomfortable environment had been created by harassment policy, making every interaction with women potential accusation. That cameras were their response to protect careers from interpretations they couldn't predict or defend against. Left meeting feeling devastated that male employees saw women's harassment reports as threats requiring surveillance protection. Posted emergency message to executive team about male employees installing cameras, claiming they needed protection from harassment claims. CEO called meeting, asking how harassment policy had resulted in male employees feeling need to install surveillance equipment. I explained I'd been taking women's harassment reports seriously and acting swiftly without requiring excessive evidence. CEO said swift action was appropriate. But looking at cases, several seemed to be normal interactions interpreted as harassment, that Christopher's professional appearance compliment, Vincent's meeting attendance decision and Gregory's technical explanation didn't seem like harassment. I said women had experienced those interactions as harassment, which meant they had harassing impact regardless of intent. CEO said impact was important, but so was intent and reasonableness of interpretation before disciplining employees. That CAMS suggested men felt they couldn't interact normally with women without risking discipline for innocent behavior. Asked me to review harassment cases to determine if interpretations had been reasonable or if policy was being misapplied. Started reviewing 12 harassment cases with new critical eye. Looking at whether complaints reflected actual misconduct. Christopher's compliment about professional dress seemed genuinely professional, not sexual. When I reread exact words, Vincent's meeting exclusion was clearly based on project assignments, not gender. When I reviewed project documentation, Gregory's technical explanation had been necessary to solve problem, Riley reported, and he'd explained similarly to men in each case. I'd believed woman's interpretation without questioning whether interpretation was reasonable given circumstances, realized that treating every interpretation as automatically valid had resulted in disciplining men for normal professional behavior. Week after camera incident, 3 male employees submitted resignation letters, citing hostile work environment, called meetings, asking why they were leaving. They said working under constant threat of harassment accusations was unsustainable. Senior developer said he'd stopped mentoring female engineers because giving feedback could be interpreted as mansplaining. Account manager said he'd stopped including women in informal networking because friendly conversation could be called harassment. Project manager said he'd stopped having career development conversations with women to avoid any comment being misinterpreted. All 3 said CAMS had been last resort attempt to protect themselves, but they'd rather work somewhere less hostile to men. I said policy was designed to protect women, not create hostile environment for men doing their jobs. They said policy had created environment where any woman could end man's career with subjective interpretation of normal interaction. That they'd watched colleagues receive permanent warnings for compliments, explanations, and operational decisions, and working in fear of career-destroying accusations over innocent behavior wasn't sustainable long-term. 2 weeks after camera incident, CEO called meeting, saying board was concerned about male employee resignations and camera situation. Said 3 talented employees had quit, citing hostile environment, and 15 others had felt need to install surveillance. That harassment policy seemed to be treating women's subjective interpretations as objective facts requiring automatic discipline, and this was creating culture where men couldn't interact normally with women without fearing career consequences. Asked whether I'd been investigating complaints objectively or just accepting interpretations without evaluating reasonableness. I said I'd been believing women and taking their experiences seriously, as policy intended. CEO said believing women meant investigating their complaints, not automatically disciplining accused without evaluating context. That several disciplined men had legitimate explanations showing interactions weren't actually harassment despite interpretations, and 3 resignations plus 15 cameras indicated serious problem with how policy was being implemented. Started feeling panicked that my implementation of Believe Women policy was being characterized as problematic. 3 weeks after camera incident, 5 more male employees installed cameras despite my directive to remove them, called them and asking why they'd installed surveillance after being told it violated company policy. They said company policy violating their ability to defend themselves against subjective accusations was worse than camera policy. That they'd consulted attorneys who said cameras in their own workspace were legal in one-party consent state, and they'd rather face discipline for cameras than face career-ending harassment accusations without evidence. I said their cameras created hostile environment, suggesting women were lying about harassment experiences. Senior engineer said hostile environment had been created by policy, allowing subjective interpretations to end careers. That Christopher's warning for professional compliment was in his permanent file, affecting his advancement forever. Vincent's warning for operational decision would impact his management opportunities, despite being project-based choice. Gregory's warning for doing his IT job had made him afraid to help female employees with technical issues, all from interpretations of normal professional behavior as harassment without considering reasonableness or context. 4 weeks after camera incident, met with company attorney about legal implications of cameras and harassment policy implementation. Attorney said cameras in employees' own workspace were likely legal, and removing them could create liability, that men's claims about needing protection from unreasonable harassment accusations had merit based on cases I'd adjudicated. Several disciplined employees could have legitimate claims that they'd been punished for normal professional behavior. I said I'd been implementing policy of believing women and taking their experiences seriously. Attorney said believing women meant investigating, not assuming every interpretation was reasonable before disciplining. That compliment about professional dress, meeting attendance based on projects, and technical explanations weren't harassment, even if women had interpreted them negatively. The interpretations weren't reasonable given actual circumstances, and pattern of disciplining men for normal behavior while accepting unreasonable interpretations created discrimination against men. Asked if camera situation and resignations could support claims that policy had created hostile environment for male employees, attorney said yes. Cameras and resignations were evidence men felt they couldn't work normally without career-threatening accusations, that I needed to review disciplinary actions and potentially rescind warnings that had been based on unreasonable interpretations. 5 weeks after camera incident, CEO mandated review of all harassment cases, with attorney evaluating reasonableness of interpretations. Attorney reviewed 12 cases and determined 8 involved unreasonable interpretations of normal professional behavior, recommended rescinding warnings for Christopher's professional compliment. Vincent's meeting decision, Gregory's technical explanation, and 5 others, that these warnings had been unjustified and keeping them in personnel files created liability for discrimination against men. I felt defensive, saying rescinding warnings would undermine women's confidence in reporting harassment. Attorney said maintaining unjustified warnings would create legal liability and had already caused resignations and surveillance response. CEO approved rescinding 8 warnings and revising harassment policy to require reasonableness evaluation before discipline. Called meetings with 8 men whose warnings were being rescinded to apologize for unjustified discipline. Christopher said he appreciated rescission, but damage was done with months of having harassment warning affecting his reputation. Vincent said rescinding warning didn't undo impact on his confidence leading team or feeling trusted by management. Gregory said he'd been afraid to help female employees with technical issues for months because of unjustified warning. All expressed that they'd lost trust in HR and company leadership, regardless of warnings being removed from files. 6 weeks after camera incident posted on social media about difficult situation where harassment policy had led to cameras and resignations. Got very mixed responses, challenging assumption that believing women meant accepting all interpretations without evaluation. Several HR professionals said policy had clearly gone too far if men felt need to install surveillance to protect themselves. One HR director commented, "Cameras are symptom of policy treating subjective interpretations as objective facts requiring automatic discipline." Another commented, 3 resignations and 15 cameras should have been immediate signal that implementation was creating problems. But some feminists defended approach, saying men installing cameras proved rape culture and desire to intimidate women. One commenter said, "Men's cameras show exactly why we need stronger harassment policies to protect women from hostile behavior." Another said, "Rescinding warnings validates men's resistance to accountability and undermines women's safety in workplace." These defensive responses felt hollow, watching talented employees resign and others install surveillance equipment. 2 months after camera incident, CEO called meeting saying board had concerns about my continued role as HR manager. Said my implementation of harassment policy had resulted in resignations, surveillance, and unjustified discipline requiring rescission, that I'd failed to evaluate reasonableness of interpretations before disciplining employees for normal professional behavior, and cameras remaining at 15 desks, despite directive to remove them, showed loss of respect for HR leadership Asked whether I could effectively manage workplace relations after creating such divisive and legally problematic situation, I felt defensive, but had to acknowledge that resignations and cameras indicated serious problems with my implementation, that I disciplined 8 employees unjustifiably by accepting unreasonable interpretations without proper investigation. Board voted to terminate me as HR manager, citing failure to implement harassment policy appropriately, creating legal and morale problems. Left company feeling devastated that trying to protect women had resulted in my termination and damaged workplace culture. Posted on feminist forums about being fired for believing women and taking harassment seriously in workplace. Got supportive responses from some feminists saying I'd been scapegoated for challenging male privilege, but also got critical responses from HR professionals saying I'd confused believing women with abandoning reasonableness standards. One HR director commented, "You can believe women while still evaluating whether their interpretations are reasonable before discipline." Another commented, "Cameras and resignations were clear evidence your policy created hostile environment for men, not protection for women." Started therapy to process termination and understand what had gone wrong with harassment policy implementation. Therapist asked what I'd hoped to achieve by automatically accepting women's interpretations as basis for discipline. I said I'd wanted to create environment where women felt believed and protected when reporting harassment. She asked if accepting unreasonable interpretations had actually protected women or created backlash, undermining legitimate claims. I was quiet because cameras and resignations suggested policy had created problems rather than protection. She said, "It sounds like you'd confused believing women with abandoning evaluation of whether interpretations were reasonable, that Christopher's professional compliment wasn't harassment even if Jessica momentarily felt uncomfortable. Vincent's meeting decision based on projects wasn't discrimination, even if Amanda felt excluded. Gregory's technical explanation wasn't mansplaining, even if Riley felt condescended, and treating those normal interactions as harassment had made men afraid to interact normally, creating actual hostile environment. This was painful realization that my policy had created the hostile environment I'd claimed to be preventing. Started thinking about pattern of accepting interpretations without evaluating reasonableness and impact on workplace. Had disciplined men for giving compliments, making operational decisions, and doing their jobs based solely on interpretations. Never questioned whether feelings of discomfort automatically meant behavior was harassment, requiring discipline. Men had responded by becoming withdrawn, refusing to mentor women, and installing cameras to protect themselves. And 3 talented employees had resigned, rather than work in an environment where normal behavior risked career consequences. 3 months after termination, started consulting work, helping companies implement harassment policies without creating hostile environments. First, client had similar situation where men had stopped interacting with women to avoid potential accusations. My experience helped them revise policy to evaluate reasonableness while still taking complaints seriously. Their policy emphasized investigating claims thoroughly rather than automatically accepting interpretations before discipline. Company avoided the backlash and surveillance response that had plagued company where I'd worked. 6 months after termination, published article about experience titled, "I Believed Every Woman Until Men Installed Cameras," detailed how accepting unreasonable interpretations had led to unjustified discipline, resignations, and surveillance. Explained that believing women should mean investigating seriously, not accepting all interpretations without reasonableness, evaluation, and that cameras and resignations had been clear evidence policy was creating hostile environment, not preventing it. Article went viral in HR community with over 500K reads and passionate responses about harassment policies. Many HR professionals appreciated honest accounting of how abandoning reasonableness standards had backfired. One HR manager said, "I almost implemented similar policy. Your article showed how it would create problems. Note solution." Another said, "Our company had men installing cameras for same reasons. Your experience helped us revise problematic policy," but some feminists criticized article, saying I'd undermined. One blogger wrote, "Author betrayed women by validating men's resistance to harassment accountability." Another wrote, requiring reasonableness, evaluation gives employers excuse to dismiss women's legitimate complaints. Year after termination reflected on how camera incident had revealed problems with my harassment policy implementation, realized biggest mistake had been treating all interpretations as equally valid, requiring automatic discipline. That professional compliments, operational decisions, and job functions weren't harassment despite momentary discomfort, and that cameras had been symptom of men feeling they needed evidence to defend against unreasonable accusations. Started doing workshops about implementing harassment policies that protected women without creating hostile environment for men. Main message was that believing women meant investigating seriously, not abandoning evaluation of reasonableness, that my policy had confused taking complaints seriously with accepting unreasonable interpretations before discipline. One workshop attendee said her company had men refusing to mentor women. Framework helped them address both harassment and overcorrection. Another said employees at his company had discussed installing cameras. Presentation helped leadership revise problematic policy. 2 years after termination, published book about experience titled When Believing Women Meant Men Installed Surveillance, detailed complete story from harassment complaints to automatic discipline to cameras to resignations to rescissions and termination. Included legal analysis about why evaluating reasonableness was necessary component of harassment investigations, and framework for taking complaints seriously while ensuring discipline was based on actual harassment, not unreasonable interpretations. Book became required reading in HR programs as case study about harassment policy implementation and unintended consequences. One law professor wrote essential text for understanding balance between believing complaints and evaluating reasonableness. Another wrote author's honest journey, from automatic discipline to understanding evaluation, helps future HR professionals. Started speaking at HR conferences about cameras incident and what it revealed about problems with my policy. Main message was that 15 men installing surveillance was clear evidence they felt normal behavior risked career consequences, that rescinding 8 warnings proved many interpretations had been unreasonable, not supported by actual circumstances. One conference attendee said men at her company had become withdrawn with women. Presentation helped her understand why. Another said his HR department had similar policy. My story convinced them to revise before creating same problems. 3 years after termination, ran into Marcus, the engineer who'd explained camera installations to me. He said company culture had improved after I'd left, and policy had been revised to evaluate reasonableness. That men had gradually removed cameras, as trust rebuilt, that normal interactions wouldn't result in unjustified discipline. Several women who'd made unreasonable complaints had learned to differentiate discomfort from actual harassment. Company had hired new HR director who investigated thoroughly rather than automatically disciplining based on interpretations. This conversation reinforced that my policy had been problem and removing me had been necessary for workplace recovery. 4 years after termination reflected on complete transformation from HR manager who'd believed every interpretation to consultant teaching proper investigation, evaluating that cameras had been symptom, revealing men felt unable to work normally without career-threatening accusations, and that 3 resignations had been employees voting with their feet that environment was unsustainable. Started consulting specifically with companies where harassment policies had created hostile environments for men, helped them implement investigation procedures, evaluating both complaints and reasonableness before discipline. One company had men refusing one-on-one meetings, with women creating actual obstacles for women's advancement, worked with them on balanced policy taking complaints seriously while ensuring discipline matched actual misconduct. Another company had culture where women's complaints were dismissed entirely as overcorrection from previous strict policy, helped them find middle ground investigating thoroughly and disciplining actual harassment. Not just discomfort. 5 years after termination, published follow-up research on workplace harassment policies and backlash effects, studied 180 companies comparing policies automatically accepting interpretations versus policies evaluating reasonableness. Found that automatic acceptance policies had 4x higher rates of men avoiding interactions with women, and 3x higher rates of men installing surveillance or recording devices for self-protection, but also had lower rates of legitimate harassment being reported because women saw overcorrection undermining credibility. Research showed that evaluating reasonableness protected both women from actual harassment and men from unreasonable accusations. Started training HR professionals on investigating harassment claims thoroughly while evaluating reasonableness. Main framework was taking every complaint seriously through investigation, not assuming interpretation automatically justified discipline. First, HR professionals implementing training reported better outcomes, with both women feeling heard and men feeling fairly treated. One HR manager that she'd been automatically disciplining, like I had, framework helped her investigate properly instead. 6 years after termination, received message from Christopher, who'd received warning for professional appearance compliment. He said warning had been rescinded, but damage to confidence and reputation had lasted much longer, that he'd stopped giving any feedback to female engineers for over a year after warning affecting their development. Eventually, new HR director had helped him understand difference between supportive feedback and harassment, but years of professional relationships had been damaged by my unjustified warning, based on unreasonable interpretation. I apologized for unjustified discipline and lasting impact on his confidence and relationships with female colleagues. He said he appreciated apology and hoped my work prevented other HR professionals from making same mistakes. That his case had become example in training about how unjustified discipline created actual barriers for women's advancement. Current reflections 7 years after male employees installed cameras, and I was devastated by what it revealed. Learned that cameras were symptom, not cause. Revealing policy made men feel normal behavior risked careers. That Christopher's compliment, Vincent's meeting decision, and Gregory's explanation weren't harassment despite interpretations. That 3 resignations and 15 cameras were clear evidence policy was creating hostile environment, not preventing it. That rescinding 8 warnings proved many interpretations had been unreasonable, not supported by circumstances. Most importantly, that believing women should mean investigating seriously, not abandoning reasonableness, evaluation before discipline. That's what I learned from being devastated when men installed cameras to protect themselves from my policy. From accepting all interpretations automatically to understanding reasonableness, evaluation protects everyone. From thinking cameras proved male hostility to recognizing they proved my policy was unjustly threatening careers. That's my complete story about harassment policy leading to surveillance and what it taught about balance and reasonableness. 7 years after cameras continued consulting work, helping companies avoid hostile environments from either harassment or overcorrection. Most impactful work involved companies recognizing early warning signs, similar to cameras and resignations. One company had men avoiding women in workplace, intervened before it became entrenched pattern, helped them implement investigation policy that took complaints seriously while evaluating reasonableness before discipline. Another company had women complaining about normal professional interactions, helped them distinguish discomfort from harassment, worked with complainant on understanding difference between feeling uncomfortable and experiencing harassment requiring discipline. 8 years after cameras published second book about sustainable harassment policies protecting everyone, detailed framework balancing serious investigation of complaints with reasonableness, evaluation before discipline, included research showing balanced policies prevented both harassment and hostile overcorrection environments. In case studies of companies avoiding problems I created by evaluating reasonableness from beginning, book became standard text for HR professionals learning to implement effective harassment policies. 9 years after cameras reflected on complete journey from automatic discipline to balanced investigation, realized that cameras had been gift, showing me policy was fundamentally flawed before more damage occurred, that men's surveillance response had forced examination, revealing 8 unjustified warnings and problematic implementation, and that my termination had been appropriate consequence for creating hostile environment through unreasonable policy. Started mentoring young HR professionals about avoiding automatic discipline while still protecting harassment victims. One mentee wanted to implement policy, accepting all interpretations like I had done. After our work together, She understood evaluation was necessary for both protecting victims and preventing unjustified discipline. Another mentee had already started automatically disciplining, helped her understand she was creating same problems I had. 10 years after cameras reflected on decade of learning from men installing surveillance, realized that 15 cameras had been clearest possible message, that policy was unjustly threatening careers, that I'd been too ideological to recognize message until resignations and attorney review forced recognition, and that Christopher, Vincent, Gregory, and 5 others had suffered unjustified discipline affecting careers and confidence. Current reflection, 11 years after male employees installed cameras, devastating me with what it revealed. Learned that cameras were rational response to policy, threatening careers for normal professional behavior. That believing women should mean investigating thoroughly, not accepting unreasonable interpretations before discipline. That 3 resignations and 15 cameras were evidence of hostile environment my policy created, not prevented. Most importantly, that rescinding 8 warnings proved reasonableness. Evaluation was necessary. In component of harassment investigation. That's everything learned from 11 years of reflection on cameras, revealing my policy's fundamental flaws. From devastated by surveillance to understanding, it was symptom of threatening normal workplace interactions. From automatic discipline to balanced investigation, evaluating both complaints and reasonableness before action. That's my final lesson about cameras teaching me. Harassment policies must protect everyone. Not just accept all interpretations,